And now, a passage from Colonial, Massachusetts, Stories of the Old Bay State, from Chapter 8, Story of King Philip's War. This conflict, which lasted for 3 years and which caused such ruin and destruction among the white settlers, forms the most dreadful chapter in the history of the New England colonies. Massasoit, the chief of the Wampanoags, with whom the Pilgrims of Plymouth made their treaty, was a brave and true man, and for 41 years until his death he faithfully kept it. He lived at Mount Hope, now in the town of Bristol, Rhode Island, and when he died he left 2 sons, Alexander and Philip. Alexander succeeded his father, but as he lived only a few months, his brother Philip became the chief of the tribe. He was the opposite of his father in character and disposition. Massasoit was mild and kindly disposed, and it is said that, only a short time before his death, he took both of his sons into the presence of some of his English neighbors, and there told them of his desire that there might always be peaceful relations between them. For 8 or 9 years after his father's death, Philip conducted himself in such a manner as to cause the settlers little trouble. But as he gradually became the owner of English firearms and found himself in friendly relations with the powerful Narragansetts, he began to plot mischief against the whites. He saw how rapidly they were spreading over the country, and probably he foresaw that there was danger of the Indians losing all control of their land. He was bold and ambitious, and caring nothing for treaties, he actually formed the wicked scheme of utterly destroying all the English settlements in New England. During the year 1670, the people of Plymouth thought the Indians were behaving in a suspicious manner. They met together frequently for a powwow, and were often found busy cleaning their firearms and grinding their hatchets. They occasionally insulted their white neighbors, and the Plymouth colony thought it was time to inquire into the matter. They sent word to the Massachusetts colony of their suspicions, and they sent on some men who, with 2 or 3 from Plymouth, made a visit to Philip. They found it hard to obtain a conference with him, and when they did, he tried in every way to evade the truth. But he did confess at last what his plans were, and they made him deliver to them the 70 English muskets he owned, and forced him to sign a new promise not to molest them. He kept his faith only a little while, however, and when they sent for him not long after to come to Plymouth, he refused. That colony wanted to attack Philip at once and stop his evil designs, but their friends in Boston were not willing, and thought there was no immediate cause for alarm. The sly Philip took advantage of the reluctance of the Massachusetts colony to act against him, and when he next went to Boston, he gave such a favorable account of his relations with the whites that the people were completely deceived. Very soon Philip actually signed another agreement, pledging good faith to the Plymouth government and promising to repair wrongs. But the wily savage only did this to deceive the whites, for he went right on with his scheme for uniting all the Indian tribes against them. The Nonatucks on the banks of the Connecticut were aware of the plot, and the Narragansetts, a numerous and powerful tribe, were willing to furnish 4,000 men. The most friendly Indians even were disaffected, but the Mohegans were true to their pledges of friendship. Sometimes the deepest laid plans of the shrewdest of plotters go wrong, and they did in the case of Philip. It was his intention not to begin the war until after 2 or 3 years of preparation, but as it happened, there came a sudden outbreak. There was a praying Indian by the name of John Sousaman, who was one of John Eliot's converts at Natick. He had fled to Philip once when in trouble, and that chief, thinking that he would be useful to him, kept him as a sort of confidential friend for some years. After a while, Sousaman's Natick friends persuaded him to return to them, and in course of time, from his mingling with some of Philip's Indians, he learned about the plots they were forming, and he hastened to tell his white friends of his discovery. But the poor fellow lost his life for his fidelity, for he was murdered by the command of Philip. His murderers, however, were soon arrested by the Plymouth authorities and hung for their crime. This made Philip so angry that he began the war which he had planned, but which he was ill prepared to carry on at that time. His first hostile act was to enter Swansea, a town near Plymouth, and kill the cattle of the settlers and plunder their homes. Then on the 24th of June, 1675, he visited Swansea again and murdered several of the inhabitants. Word was hastily sent to Boston, and a volunteer company of 110 men was dispatched from there. Meeting the men from Plymouth at Swansea, they had a skirmish with the Indians, and half a dozen Indians were killed. This was unexpected bad luck for Philip, and he retreated to Mount Hope with his remaining force. The Indians all over the country were surprised at this sudden breaking out of the war, and were not at all prepared for it. Some of them hesitated about joining Philip as they had promised, but gradually the spirit of war spread from tribe to tribe, and there were outbreaks in many places. The people of Brookfield were one day surprised by an attack of Indians, and they all fled to a house that had been somewhat fortified. They had scarcely entered when the savages were upon them, and firing from the loopholes in the house, they killed many of their dusky enemies. While this was going on, the other savages were burning the houses and barns and yelling like demons over their work. They were determined, if possible, to set fire to the fortified house and burn all the people in it. For this purpose they fired burning arrows and put torches on long poles and pushed them as near the house as possible. Finding that this plan failed, they took a cart and, filling it with combustible material, set it on fire and pushed it up very close to the house. The poor people inside thought that they were surely doomed to death, but a providential shower of rain came and put out the fire. But the Indians still persisted in their fiendish designs, and so, when night came, they stole around to the rear of the house and set fire to it there. The inmates were then in such danger that the men bravely resolved to go out to the well and draw water with which to quench the fire. Though the Indian arrows whizzed past them continually while they were doing this, none of them were hurt. The Indians, having destroyed the town of Brookfield, retired on the 5th of August, leaving the survivors among the people homeless and destitute. Some of the Indians who were among the besiegers, having been driven off by men who came from Springfield and other places to the town's relief, fled to the shelter of a swamp. There, a short time after, Philip made his appearance with 40 men and a large number of women and children. Of course, he was much elated with the story of the successful attack upon Brookfield, which the besiegers told him. He showed his pleasure at the news by distributing a peck of unstrung wampum to 3 of the Nipmuc chiefs in whose country they were encamped. Philip at that time was not well supplied with men. When he set out from Mount Hope, he had an army of 250. But many of them had been killed and others had deserted him, so that now he had only 40 men left. But he was determined to keep on with his bloody work, and sudden attacks were made upon the whites in every direction. The Indians' favorite method of warfare was to conceal themselves, or lie in ambush, as it is called, and then suddenly spring out upon their victims. Captain Beers at one time started off with 36 mounted men to carry provisions to the garrison and settlers at Northfield, and as their way lay through a dense forest, it was difficult to make progress. They had arrived quite near their journey's end, and were hoping soon to reach Northfield when, in crossing a ravine, they came upon an ambuscade. The Indians sprang out from their hiding place, and firing right and left upon the men, killed a large number. The rest of the company fled, the Indians pursuing, but Captain Beers bravely rallied them on the brow of a hill not far from where the first attack was made, and there he fought them until he fell dead himself. The Indians were not contented with killing the whites, but in this battle, as in many others, they mutilated their dead bodies in a shocking manner. The town of Deerfield had a dreadful experience during this war. Its rich meadows were remarkably fertile, and at this time the inhabitants had in the field and already stacked 3,000 bushels of corn. They were afraid their Indian enemies might destroy it, so a company of 80 young soldiers from the eastern part of the state, most of them from the county of Essex, were sent under the leadership of Captain Lathrop of Salem, with a great many teams to secure the corn. During their march no Indians were to be seen, and when they had loaded their teams they set out on their return. They had reached a place nearly opposite Sugarloaf Mountain in Deerfield when they stopped to rest. Tradition says they even took time to refresh themselves with some wild grapes that had climbed upon the trees near. At all events, they were off their guard, and 700 Indians, who were concealed behind the trees and among the brush on the side of the brook, sprang upon them, and a bloody fight followed. It is supposed that Philip was there himself, and that he directed the terrible slaughter. The brave Captain Lathrop fell early in the action, and his men, each getting behind a tree, tried to defend themselves as well as they could. But the Indians soon gained the day, and only a small number of the valiant company of young men escaped with their lives. When the news reached Deerfield garrison, Captain Mosley started off with his little company for the scene. They found the victorious Indians grouped together, engaged in the dreadful work of stripping the slain and mutilating the bodies of their victims. Captain Mosley's men charged upon them, and many sought safety in flight. The ammunition of the others failed, and they had to retreat. A reinforcement of 100 white men arriving just then, the victory was made sure, and thus ended the most terrible massacre that ever happened in New England. From this time, Philip met with many reverses, and when success no longer attended him in Massachusetts, those of his Indian friends who had been his firm allies began to desert him. There seemed no security for him in any place, and sometimes he narrowly escaped capture. Once he was obliged to flee so suddenly that he had to leave his wife and child behind him, as well as his wampum. His had become a lost cause, and he was driven from place to place as a fugitive until at last he drifted back to the vicinity of his old home on Mount Hope. His death occurred in this wise. He had ordered one of his own men killed, and the brother of his victim, fearing that he might share the same fate, went to Captain Church, who was in command of the whites, and offered to lead him to the swamp where Philip was encamped. This Indian, whose name was Alderman, kept his agreement, and led by him Captain Church and his men entered the swamp and surprised Philip there. He tried to escape, but as it happened, he was slain by the bullets of Alderman, whose brother he had lately killed. The dreadful war thus brought to a close was a disastrous one to the colonies, for it cost them 600 lives, besides the loss of 13 towns and 600 buildings, most of them the dwelling houses of the people. There was scarcely a family in all Massachusetts, or in fact throughout New England, that did not mourn the loss of some relative killed in King Philip's War. If you enjoy High Americana, please head on over to Patreon, where you can support the channel and audio requests can be made. Thank you.